It's officially spooky season, and as the trailers used to say, if it's Halloween, it must be Saw. This is a series where I completely acknowledge the average quality is pretty low, but it's also kind of my baby. I watched through these when I was younger, and they were pretty significant in expanding my love for horror as a genre. So please try to keep in mind for the duration of this video that this is my list, and the opinions are entirely subjective. There will be spoilers in here, so if you haven't seen them yet, then go do that first. However, if you've already watched all 10 of these films, or just don't really care about spoilers, then relax and check out my list of every Saw movie ranked from worst to best. So Saw 4 is the only film in the series where I genuinely don't have any redeeming thing to say about it. Even the bad movies in this franchise have one or two things that I can at least appreciate about them, but this one just doesn't do anything for me. I suppose the elephant in the room is that Jigsaw himself, John Kramer, is now dead, so this is where we start the Hoffman era, and everything kind of goes off the rails. Now, I know they're all violent and brutal in their own ways, but I can't help but feel that this is the one that cemented the series as torture porn. The blood and gore, while squirmish, always seemed justified to me in the original three, but Saw 4 is just gross. Daniel Rigg, the C-list cop character from the previous two films, is now the lead, and still doesn't have much personality to him. His entire motivation seems to be saving the day and rescuing people from danger, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but that brings us to the series' worst excuse for putting someone in a trap. Where other people in the film are tested because they're physically or sexually violent, Riggs' game is based entirely on the fact that he tries too hard to save people and doesn't let them save themselves, which is a really stupid moral code to follow, even for Jigsaw. I think the twist is fine, it's not on the same level as the first three films, but it is unexpected. I don't think of it as one of the worst reveals because in some of the other films in this list, you see the end coming a mile away, where this one is fairly good at keeping its cards close to its chest. However, the two factors playing into the reveal, the fact that Art isn't really the killer, and that Hoffman is Jigsaw's secret apprentice, are twists that have already been done before. We're recycling ideas, and we're only in the third sequel by this point. I also think that the traps in here aren't super memorable, like most of the movie to be honest, with the only one I always seem to recall being the hair-pulling scalping machine. The others just kind of blend into the background of the franchise, which is something that this movie just does a lot. Its worst qualities are some of the series' lowest points, and its high points don't stand out all that much. It's a pretty bad movie, and even as someone who was a bit of a Saw apologist, I can't wholly recommend this one to people. Saw 3D is the seventh and final entry in the original run of films, and while it's not a great movie, I like this a lot more than Saw 4. I think that as a whole, it's decently entertaining for most of its runtime, and the choice to focus this new set of games on a man who faked being in a trap previously is a pretty interesting idea. Someone pretending to be a Jigsaw survivor is definitely something that would happen in real life, and for someone to be called out for that and tested is a real good setup. It is, however, one of the franchise's meanest and nihilistic entries with how it treats certain characters. By all means, have the cowardly, conceited fame monster go through his test for life, but the fact that his completely innocent and unaware wife is roasted alive inside of a brazen bull because he couldn't complete his final test just sits wrong with me. Most of the blood in this movie is a weird neon pinky colour. I'm not sure if that's a side effect of it being 3D, but it looks awful. This is also the one where they give Tobin Bell a backwards cap and expect that to work as a de-aging mechanic. It spawned a bunch of memes and is pretty hilarious, even in context of the film. This is another entry of the Hoffman saga, who isn't a particularly interesting character at the best of times, but in this one takes it to a whole other level where he essentially becomes the Terminator. While the main trap plot is playing out, the B story covers Hoffman having to cover his tracks and just going on an onslaught, murdering countless police officers and hunting down Jill, Jigsaw's ex-wife. Somehow he doesn't get caught, he's never outmatched in a fight, and gets away with almost everything. That's if it wasn't for our final reveal. This is the one where Dr. Gordon comes back, who hasn't been seen since the original film, and is revealed to be a third secret apprentice of Jigsaw, and locks Hoffman up in the bathroom from Saw 1. This twist is super obvious from early on, because Gordon shows up at Bobby's fake Jigsaw Survivor Anonymous meeting, acting all weird and shady. I do like the actual ending though, where he leaves Hoffman to die and throws away the hacksaw. Overall, a bad movie with good moments. Saw 5 is one of the entries in the series that I actually like a little less than I did the first time I saw it. I think that's because I always remember it for the main trap plot where 5 people have to progress through a series of rooms, each containing a different test for the members of the team. I really appreciate the twist reveal that instead of killing each other off one by one as they move through the rooms, they instead could have worked together to all escape. For example, the first room with the cable collars all used the same key to unlock, so they could have used one key to escape instead of fighting their way to the front. Or how all 5 of them could have taken a small electric shock to open that one door instead of frying one person to death. The idea that they have to put aside their selfish instincts is a good one, even if it contradicts Saw 4 a bit. Rig was tested because he's too selfless, and these people were tested because they're too selfish. That's a pretty tight line you've got to walk if you don't want to become a target of Jigsaw. However, the reason my feelings changed for this film is because I forgot just how much of it is Agents Hoffman and Straum playing cat and mouse with each other. After John and Amanda die in Saw 3, Hoffman takes up the mantle for the next 4 movies, and he just really isn't as interesting or as entertaining as Jigsaw himself. Most of this movie follows Straum investigating the case and picking up clues to work out what we already know, and then spelling it out for us because the movie thinks we're stupid or something. The rest has Hoffman planting evidence to try and frame Straum as the copycat killers so he can get away with everything. Saw 5 might also have the most unlikely turn of events where everything has to play out in this specific way for Hoffman's plan to work. In the end, Straum finds Hoffman's home and goes down into the basement where he finds a coffin coated in broken glass and a tape recorder. When he plays the message, he hears Hoffman tell him that the only way out of the room is to get inside the coffin. Then he hears Hoffman outside, so he pauses the recording and pushes him inside the coffin instead, only to play the rest of the tape and hear that if he doesn't get in, he'll never be heard from again, and the walls begin to close and just crush him to death as the coffin sinks safely into the floor. There are so many ways that this could have played out, and for this to happen is kind of a miracle for Hoffman. It's not the worst, and has more to like than the previous two, but it's still a pretty flat movie overall. So I think that Jigsaw is possibly the most over-hated movie in this franchise. Don't get me wrong, I don't love it, but a lot of die-hard Saw fans will have this at the bottom of their lists, and it ain't that bad. I actually think that this is the first film on my list that is passable as a decent movie. Since it isn't tied to the original 7 films, acting as a soft reboot, the film has a much cleaner look than the originals. It's obviously not stuck in the mid-2000s anymore, and is probably the best directed movie in the franchise, looking much more high-budget and current than any of the others. I think it might have some of the worst characters of all the films though, because frankly I don't remember who any of them are or what their names are. Some of the traps are kind of cool, like the cable trap that's designed to cut off the one guy's legs, and the grain silo one with all the falling debris. The biggest problem is I forget most of this movie. Whenever I watch it, it's like, oh yeah, there's this whole subplot about a Jigsaw fan site and stuff. None of that ever sticks with me, so when I think about this film, I only ever seem to recall the ending, where it's revealed that Logan, the police coroner, is actually behind all the murders, since John Kramer has, been dead for 10 years. I don't actually mind the twist that the trap plot took place 10 years before the cop plot, even though that twist had already been used in the series as well, or that Logan recreated one of Kramer's early traps to try and frame Detective Halloran. But I do take issue with the film insinuating that Logan is yet another Jigsaw apprentice. Not only is he the 4th one that we know of, but he's the 1st chronologically. He was there before Gordon, before Amanda, and even before Hoffman. I love a good twist, I do, but this one took it a little too far and ends up taking away from the other movies. Like I said, it's not a great film, but don't let people trick you into thinking this is the worst one, because it just isn't. It's fine, and that's where I'm at with it. Saw 6 seems to be a fan favourite amongst the later sequels in the series, and I'd say mostly for the right reasons. In a weirdly out-of-the-blue move, the Saw franchise decided to get political here and tackled the health insurance industry and how slimy they can be when it comes to finding loopholes and avoiding payouts. So the main character of this film's trap plot is William Easton, the vice president for the Department of Claims at a certain healthcare company, and he's here for devising a superficially complex formula that resulted in a bunch of people being refused treatment for their health problems. However, instead of our protagonist having to mutilate himself in order to learn a lesson, he has to move from room to room and decide who to save out of the people he works with. This is where we get some of the more iconic traps in the series for me, like the barbed wire nooses and the shotgun carousel, but then there is some more typical Jigsaw bullshittery, like how the first test has him in an oxygen mask that forces a machine to clamp down on his torso for every breath he takes, but he's paired up against the company's janitor, who is a regular smoker. Like, come on dude, you're gonna put this guy in a trap because he smokes? And then you're also going to set him up against a man who doesn't smoke in a game of who can hold their breath the longest? Where's his chance of redemption? The cop plot of Saw 6 is pretty much just more of what we had in Saw 5, but with Straum out of the picture, it's mostly Hoffman trying to run the games without getting caught, and it's a little boring to watch. Other than that one scene where they're decrypting the voice on the recorder saying, "Right now you're feeling helpless," which is a pretty nice touch, the whole Hoffman storyline is just a bit tired by now. I'm a little sick of the guy, and I don't really want to spend more time watching this character with no charisma torture people to death. That being said, the twist of William not being the father of the two kidnap victims and instead being the man who essentially let the actual father die is pretty good and makes for a satisfying finale. Even if I do feel bad because the guy kind of did everything he had to do. He says it isn't his game, but he still had to do a lot of stuff and endure a good amount of pain. I don't know, it just seems unfair to me, but I do think that Saw 6 is definitely one of the better entries in the series. Saw 3 is a film that I didn't really like for the longest time because of how mean-spirited it seemed to be and really ramped up the gore factor without it being completely necessary. However, as time goes on, I've actually come to appreciate what it does right and realize that a lot of the decisions it made do make sense in relation to the theme of the story. Similarly to the health executive in Saw 6, Jeff has to save other people from their traps. It's all about being able to forgive the people that led to the accidental death of his son, from the hit-and-run driver who actually did it, to a witness who fled the scene instead of providing a testimony. This has always been one of the more interesting and understandable motivations for Jigsaw to test somebody, to see whether he'd be able to overcome his grief and anger, or if he'd stand by and watch them suffer. Also, all of the traps actually seem doable for me in this one. There isn't really any bullshit logic that makes them impossible or overly self-destructive. Things like having to burn the toys of your recently deceased child to save the judge who let the killer off lightly. He doesn't have to endure torture or anything, it's just move on from the incident. But Saw 3's biggest problem, I think, is how it shackles John Kramer to a bed for the whole movie. It's nice that he's still alive in this one, albeit barely. However, he doesn't seem to be having a sick sense of fun in the same way he does in Saw 2, because he's literally dying in a hospital bed. Also, Jeff just kind of sucks as a protagonist because of how slow and hesitant he is to act and save anyone. The guy is practically dawdling along without any sense of urgency, which makes for a really frustrating watch. This man has the easiest time of any of Jigsaw's victims, and he really doesn't take advantage of that. He kind of mopes for the whole movie. However, once again, I like the twist ending where it's revealed that Lynn, who's been tasked with keeping John alive, is actually Jeff's wife, and the whole thing has really been Amanda's game to see if she could resist killing the participants because she has a habit of making unwinnable traps. It's super bleak as a conclusion to what was originally a trilogy, but I think it works overall, at least far better than endings like Saw 5 did. Along with Jigsaw, I'd say that Spiral is one of the most overhated entries in this franchise. I know it's not a masterpiece or anything, but diehard Saw fans just seem to hate anything different that doesn't follow John Kramer. But for this one, I think the switch to a police procedural setting is a much needed change for the franchise, which manages to stick to its core premise without requiring the viewer to sit through people being tortured again. I do think that the premise was wasted a little in areas, and the theme of police corruption could have been explored deeper, but the actual motive of this film's killer, Detective Schenk, is the most believable in the series, at least until Saw 10. The twist reveal of who the killer is set up reasonably well for you to work out, even if it is a little obvious. I mean, I think it's good that it doesn't rely on a last-minute reveal of previously withheld information to surprise us, but the way the film is edited kind of gives this away around halfway through if you're paying attention. Believe it or not, I didn't hate Chris Rock in this. I thought he was fine considering this is the first dramatic role I've seen him in, and he obviously did the best he could. Also, they managed to get Samuel L. Jackson to be in this movie, and I don't really think he adds much to the experience, even if it is fun to hear him talk about Jigsaw. Obviously though, with Kramer being dead and having a new killer in town, Tobin Bell didn't return for this one, the only film in the series not to feature him. So instead of that voice we're all familiar with and Billy the Puppet, there's a creepy AI-generated voice, which I actually kinda like. Yeah, it's not as iconic as the Jigsaw voice, but there's something cool about it. It's obviously someone trying to remain anonymous, but it also has an uncanny valley thing going on. And the traps are so-so. Watching someone get waterboarded with hot wax is uncomfortable for sure, but none of them really stick with me except for the guy having his fingers pulled off. So yeah, not only would I say that Spiral is overhated, I'd actually say it's underrated. Check it out if you haven't seen it. The most recent entry in the series, Saw 10, decides that instead of focusing primarily on gross-out gore effects, don't worry though, there's still plenty here, that it will build its story around Jigsaw himself. Being set between Saw 1 and 2, the film manages to bypass the issue of its main character being dead, and goes through an experience that actually has a compelling story. In fact, the first half hour or so of this feels like a completely different movie and felt very out of place in the Saw franchise. The story actually has an emotional center and makes the victims such awful people that you end up rooting for John. And not in the same way you did in, like, Saw 6, but because the film frames him as an anti-hero. It is a little weird at first because, as always, Jigsaw's logic is super flawed, but then again, Tobin Bell is so good in this that you kind of want to be on his side. There are some slight hiccups for me, like how John is still able to predict seemingly everything that will happen days ahead of time, and I think despite everything that happens here, the character of Dr. Peterson gets off kind of lightly, especially considering the horrible fates that the others go through. But this is definitely the movie where John is most justified in doing his thing. Instead of being like, you self-harm so you don't appreciate life, he actively makes people repent for taking advantage of vulnerable and desperate people, and essentially stealing their money. So John goes to Mexico to receive an experimental treatment for his cancer, but these people take his money, drug him up, and don't perform any surgery on him. These are awful people, and you kind of just want to see them get what they deserve, except maybe Valentina. That was just sad. The traps are kind of mid for the series, and the twist isn't all that special or compelling, but overall though, I'd say that the care and detail put into this one definitely paid off, because it actually feels like a proper movie. It had time to bake before being pushed out into the world, where the main series was released year after year, and I think the lack of pre-production hurt them overall. But here, you're not watching this for the traps, you're watching this for the character of John Kramer, and in that sense, it's a pretty good time. Saw 2 is kind of everything you'd expect a good sequel to be. It ups the stakes from the original film and features more characters, more twists, and obviously, more traps. But despite being a step up in gore factor from Saw 1, this movie is still relatively tame when compared to later entries like Saws 3 through 7. The focus doesn't seem to be on the people suffering as much as it does on the actual theme of the person's test. This might be the film with the most appropriate and doable traps in relation to why they were chosen. Xavier, for example, has to dig through a pit of used syringes to find a key because he's a known drug dealer. Out of all the sequels, I also think that Saw 2 has the best cold open with the super memorable Venus flytrap mask. A guy has to use a scalpel to cut a key out from behind his eye before the time runs out, otherwise the mask shuts closed and will kill him on the spot. I think a lot of these super simple traps, like the reverse bear trap, become the most memorable. A lot of the later, more complex ones tend to get lost in the mix a little bit. Anyway, you also have a lot of Jigsaw in this one. It's probably the most Tobin Bell you get in any of the films, and he's just super good in this. He's cold and calculating, and is a lot of fun to watch, even if his logic is sketchy at best. He literally says stuff like, "Oh, I never murdered anyone." Like, yeah, you kinda did, dude. But I'd say that overall, despite having more characters than the original film, none of them are as interesting as they could be. They're all fairly one-note, except for maybe Detective Matthews and Amanda, which kind of brings me on to the end reveal of the film. So the whole trap plot of the movie takes place around 2 days before the cop plot, and the footage they're watching on the monitors is being played back on VHS to psych them out. The events have already happened. When Matthews takes Jigsaw to the house and the timer runs out in the warehouse, a safe opens up nearby with his son Daniel inside, because John did say he was in a safe place. And then you have the final twist of Amanda being in on the whole thing and John's secret apprentice who'll carry on his work when he dies. It's all super unexpected, and while the later sequels turn this stuff into a whole soap opera, I genuinely really like it here as a surprise ending. It's overall a pretty fun experience from start to finish, and hasn't quite developed the tedious, repetitive nature that it would go on to later. Yes, I think that James Wan's original film is still the best. Don't get me wrong, it's hardly a flawless movie with two bad actors desperately trying to maintain their American accents, and a few logistical plot holes here and there, but that's just par for the course in this series. What it does well, it does really well, and not just for the franchise, but the genre as a whole. There's a reason that this kickstarted a whole movement in the horror sphere, circa 2004. It was so different and creative that it was kind of inevitable it was gonna get sequels. The story is way more focused in this one than the others because it doesn't have gaps in the story to fill, or need to fit a quota of flashback sequences in there. You just have a basic cop plot with Danny Glover and his partner trying to capture Jigsaw, and two men in a dirty bathroom trying to figure out why they're there. This film doesn't have a whole warehouse of traps to catch people in, it mostly takes place in one room, where the characters have to talk to each other to figure out how to escape. Lawrence is tasked with killing Adam before 6 o'clock, while Adam has to somehow talk his way out of it. And that's what works here. Even though the acting is a bit ropey, the characters are all really good, and are easily my favourites in the series. In spite of the quote-unquote torture porn reputation that the sequels develop for themselves, the first film is actually quite tame in how much blood is spilled. Most of the fear comes from the atmosphere of the sets and the frenetic editing designed to disorient the viewer and make them uncomfortable. Yeah, there's a few gunshots here and there, but if we're talking torture or self-mutilation, there's only one scene in the whole movie, and most of that gore is off-screen. This was a low-budget film that couldn't afford copious amounts of blood or prosthetic limbs, so a lot of it is left to the imagination. And then, of course, you have the twist. In one of horror's most surprising and unexpected twist endings, the dead body on the floor that's been there from the very beginning stands up to reveal himself as the Jigsaw killer, and leaves Adam trapped in the bathroom with the lights off forever. It's a super effective ending and introduced the world to Hello Zep, the musical motif that would go on to become the Saw theme in future movies. I'd argue this is the film that accomplished what it set out to do the most, and also made for the most rewatchable and entertaining film of the series. And that's my Saw ranking. Let me know what you think, and be sure to tell me how wrong I am in the comments. Put your own ranking down there, because I'm always curious to hear other people's thoughts on the films I'm interested in, so that'll be a lot of fun for me. But anyways, for now, thank you very much for watching. Be sure to follow me on Letterboxd, link in the description to keep up with what I'm watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.